What happens when a king dares to defy the gods? In the heart of ancient Greece, there was a king named Erysichthon, a ruler not celebrated for his wisdom, but infamous for his unchecked arrogance. While other kings honored the gods, offering sacrifices and seeking their favor, Erysichthon stood apart. He believed himself untouchable, dismissing the divine as mere superstition. His pride grew so immense that he no longer saw the gods as forces to be respected, but as obstacles to be overcome. His hubris led him to a sacred grove, a place where even the wind whispered the name of Demeter, goddess of the harvest and fertility. The grove was no ordinary forest. It was a living altar, its towering trees representing the heart of the earth, the blessings of the gods, and the delicate balance between mortals and the divine. To the people of his kingdom, this grove was sacred, untouchable. But Erysichthon was deaf to the pleas of his advisors, blind to the warnings etched in the earth itself. With a wave of his hand, he ordered the mighty trees to be felled, their ancient trunks splintering beneath the blades of his men. Each strike echoed through the heavens. The ground trembled as if in mourning, the leaves falling like silent tears. But as the final tree fell, the air grew still, unnaturally quiet. Erysichthon stood triumphant amidst the ruin, unaware that the gods were watching, their eyes fixed on the mortal who had dared to challenge their power. Erysichthon's men, though their hands trembled with fear, obeyed their king's ruthless command. The first swing of the axe against the ancient wood echoed unnaturally, as if the earth itself recoiled in pain. The sound wasn't just heard in the forest. It traveled through the winds, reaching the ears of gods. Tree after tree fell, their roots clawing desperately at the soil, their towering forms crashing to the ground with a final mournful groan. But among these mighty trees stood one unlike the others, sacred beyond measure. Inside it dwelled a nymph, cherished by Demeter herself, who had once whispered secrets of the earth to the goddess. Erysichthon's eyes burned with greed as his men hesitated before the sacred tree. But the king, fueled by arrogance, gave a cruel laugh and ordered its destruction. As the axe struck, the tree groaned as if alive, its branches trembling, and with every creak, the sky seemed to darken. The sacred nymph's spirit cried out, vanishing as the tree splintered and fell. Erysichthon stood triumphant, unaware of the silent storm brewing far above him. Demeter, watching from her divine realm, had witnessed everything. Her heart swelled with grief and rage, and in that very moment, a curse was sealed. Erysichthon had not just cut down a tree, he had uprooted his own fate. The hunger that would soon grow within him would be insatiable, a dark force that no feast could ever satisfy, a hunger that would consume not just his body, but his soul. In the days after the sacred grove fell, something unsettling stirred within Erysichthon. At first, it was just a flicker of discomfort, a faint gnawing in his stomach that no amount of food seemed to ease. The grand feasts, once enough to quell his hunger, suddenly felt inadequate. He ordered more and more to be brought before him, roasted meats, rich breads, fruits from across the land, yet none of it satisfied him. The hunger, instead of fading, only intensified. It twisted inside him, growing fiercer with each passing day. His advisors, watching from the shadows, whispered amongst themselves. They had seen their king feast before, but this was different. There was a desperation in his eyes, a frantic need to consume that went beyond any human craving. Soon, Erysichthon was no longer the king they knew. His thoughts, once sharp and commanding, had narrowed to a single, insatiable focus: food. Day after day, he devoured everything laid before him with a ravenous frenzy. Yet no matter how much he ate, his hunger remained unquenched. It began to consume him, not just his body, but his very mind. There were no words of wisdom left, no decisions for his kingdom. Only the gnawing, endless need. He tore through his palace stores, emptying granaries, and still the hunger clawed at him. It was as if something darker, something far more sinister than mere hunger, was eating him from the inside. What had begun as a whisper in his stomach had now become a deafening roar, and the true horror of Demeter's curse was just beginning. Erysichthon's hunger was like a storm, growing with every bite, every feast, every morsel. What began as a gnawing in his stomach soon consumed his very soul. His palace, once filled with abundance, was reduced to empty halls echoing with his desperation. He ordered more food, but it was never enough. The granaries that had once nourished hundreds were left barren. His people, who once admired their king, now whispered in fear as they watched him waste away, his body becoming as hollow as his endless craving. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, grew wild, filled with the madness of a man who could never be satisfied. But hunger has no mercy. Erysichthon, in his desperation, turned to the treasures of his kingdom. Golden artifacts, sacred heirlooms, even entire stretches of land. He traded them all for food, trying to fill the void that gnawed at him from within. Yet no matter how much he devoured, the emptiness only deepened. He grew thinner, his riches vanished, and soon, even his own family was not spared from his insatiable greed. Erysichthon sold his daughter, his last precious possession, for a fleeting moment of relief. But even then, the hunger remained, relentless, mocking him with each bite. It was no longer food he craved, it was something far beyond the reach of mortal hands. As Erysichthon's wealth vanished, so did the last remnants of his dignity. The king who once held power over a prosperous land was now reduced to a pitiful figure, roaming the streets in rags, his once proud gaze now hollow and pleading. The man who had dined in opulence was begging for scraps, a king in name only, as his people starved while he devoured everything in sight. The hunger gnawed at him, relentless, insatiable. His palace, once filled with riches, was stripped bare, sold off to feed his ravenous appetite. Yet nothing could satisfy the abyss within him. Desperation twisted his mind as the curse sank its claws deeper. And then, in a moment of madness, he did the unthinkable. He sold his own daughter, his flesh and blood, into slavery. A king, bartering his child for a fleeting meal. The exchange barely satisfied him for a heartbeat before the hunger returned, fiercer than ever. The gods, watching from above, were unmoved by his sacrifices of gold, land, and blood. There would be no mercy for Erysichthon. His fate had been sealed long ago, and with nothing left to sell, no one left to betray, he stood on the brink of an unspeakable end. The curse was not just hunger, it was the slow, inevitable consumption of his very soul. Erysichthon's descent into madness had become unstoppable. His grand feasts, once overflowing with the richest foods and finest wines, had dwindled into pitiful scraps scavenged from the barren earth. The king, once surrounded by wealth and power, was now a gaunt shadow of his former self. His treasures were gone, traded for fleeting moments of satisfaction. His family had abandoned him, unable to bear the sight of their father's insatiable hunger. Wandering aimlessly through the wilderness, he sought anything at all, that might fill the void tearing him apart from within. But the curse was relentless. The more he devoured, the deeper the hunger clawed at him. Desperation gave way to madness. Erysichthon's mind, tormented by the unending hunger, could no longer distinguish between food and flesh. And so, in the most grotesque twist of fate, he turned to the only source of sustenance left, himself. His own body became his final meal. Piece by piece, he tore at his skin, his own fingers, each bite a futile attempt to satisfy the insatiable craving that had haunted him since the day he angered the goddess Demeter. His sanity, too, was consumed in those final moments, as the cursed king devoured himself, becoming his own undoing. Erysichthon was not defeated by his enemies or the gods, but by his own ravenous greed, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell. With Erysichthon's demise, his kingdom crumbled into desolation. Once lush and fertile, the fields that had sustained his people for generations now stood barren, their life force drained by the same greed that had devoured their king. The land, once vibrant and thriving, seemed to wither under the weight of his reckless hunger. His people, once proud subjects, now wandered the empty fields in despair, their eyes hollow with starvation. Erysichthon's name became a whisper, spoken only in hushed tones, no longer a king to be revered, but a cautionary tale etched into the very soil he had ruined. The winds that once carried songs of prosperity now howled through the empty halls of his abandoned palace, carrying only the echo of his misdeeds. The wealth and glory that had once surrounded Erysichthon had vanished like a fleeting dream. Those who had once bowed before him now cursed his memory, for it was his insatiable appetite that had left them to suffer in a kingdom devoid of life. Erysichthon's downfall was swift, but the shadow of his deeds stretched far beyond his lifetime. His once grand legacy, tarnished by arrogance and disregard for the divine, was a warning left to future generations. His name would not be remembered for greatness or conquest. It would echo in the hearts of those who heard his story, a grim reminder of what happens when a king, blinded by greed, takes too much from the world around him. Erysichthon's tale is one of those ancient stories that lingers in the shadows of time, whispered in the halls of kings and around the fires of humble homes. Once he was a king, arrogant, proud, and unyielding. He looked at the sacred grove of Demeter and saw not the beauty or power it held, but only trees to be felled, land to be conquered. His hands, stained with the sap of the sacred, set in motion a curse no mortal could ever escape. The first blow of his axe did more than split the wood. It severed the fragile bond between man and God. In the days that followed, something twisted began to grow inside Erysichthon. It started as a hunger, small at first, but soon grew into something monstrous. No banquet could satisfy him. No feast could quell the gnawing emptiness inside. Day by day, bite by bite, he consumed everything. His palace was stripped bare, his people left in shock and despair. His hunger had no end. Even the finest of foods turned to dust in his mouth, leaving him desperate for more. When nothing remained, when all had been devoured, Erysichthon turned to the only thing left, himself. It was in this final, horrifying act that the king, once mighty and proud, succumbed to his curse, his hunger devouring him from within. And so his name became legend, a warning of what happens when mortals dare challenge forces far beyond their control.